Recently Germany announced that okay, it will send 5 billion to Ukraine as a military assistance. Obviously, they always call it humanitarian assistance, but obviously, as we know, that it is a tactic to push the war against Russia. It has always been, obviously. So March, it's kind of funny because March is recently came out supporting. Palestine in a way, not in a vocal way, but he is actually targeting Israel, saying they are doing what they are doing in Gaza is wrong. But at the same time, he is supporting Ukraine to push the war against Russia, right? So in a recent statement, he's basically warned Russia to not, if they don't agree to the ceasefire, they will continue to provide arms to Israel, arms to Ukraine, and more military aid to Ukraine, more paychecks to Ukraine. So here is Mars, who is recently saying that in a press conference. Let me share it with you. Okay, so here it is.
Wir werden unsere militärische Unterstützung fortsetzen und wir werden sie ausbauen, damit sich die Ukraine jetzt und in Zukunft eben gegen diese russische Aggression weiter zur Wehr setzen kann. Unsere Verteidigungsminister werden heute eine Absichtserklärung über die Beschaffung weitreichender Waffensysteme aus ukrainischer Produktion, sogenannter Long-Range Fires, unterzeichnen. Es wird hierbei keine Reichweitenbeschränkungen geben. Die Ukraine kann sich damit vollumfänglich verteidigen, auch gegen militärische Ziele außerhalb des eigenen Staatsgebiets. Gehen Sie davon aus, dass die Weigerung der russischen Seite, Gespräche zu führen, die Weigerung, einen Waffenstillstand einzuhalten, jetzt wirklich
So your thoughts on it?
Well, if we respond to your introduction, really, you were talking about, on the one level, what he's saying about Palestine, on another level, what he's saying about Ukraine. One side, it's Israel. One side, it's Russia. So what appears to be happening is if Trump is genuinely pulling back from the conflict in Ukraine and providing less and less money to bankroll this fascist regime in Kiev and less armaments, I mean, Merz is trying to say they're supplying humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but military hardware, military components, military arms is not humanitarian aid. So there's an automatic contradiction on what he's trying to say. From what I've heard and what I've read, what they're talking about is building a long-range missile factory in Ukraine to allow the Ukrainian fascist regime, which is no longer democratically elected. If you remember, when Zelensky was elected, he said he was going to bring peace. He was going to end the conflict. And then, like a lot of politicians, they say one thing in order to get elected, and then once in power, all bets are off. They do whatever it is that they want. So the Germans don't want to supply their own missiles because some of the NATO countries, some of the European countries are saying we've already depleted our arms stock and we are putting ourselves at risk and we will become vulnerable from attack. I have no idea who they think this attack's going to come from, but I guarantee you it won't be Russia. Russia will only attack Europe if Europe attacks Russia. So by building the missiles in Ukraine, they can say that these are domestic Ukrainian missiles, nothing to do with Germany, although they will be supplying the technology, they will be supplying the hardware, they will be supplying the money that is required in order to build these. So if you go back to what Trump tried to do in his first presidency, which is says we're no longer carrying NATO, this is a complete joke.
Right.
There are 750 American bases throughout the world. So the Americans are not, they are not bankrolling NATO. What they have is an American military presence within all of the NATO countries, including Britain and including Germany. And to me, that is a form of empirical control over the states, that they have these soldiers and bases and nuclear weapons in. So they're claiming it's for the defense of Europe, but at the same time, they can quietly say to the German government, well, we've 10,000 troops here. You have to play ball and you have to go along. Now, when it comes to what he's saying about Palestine,
Mm-hmm.
this seems to be the narrative appears to have shifted
Mm-hmm.
in the Western hegemonic sphere, where I think two things are happening. One of them is the lip service being paid by the politicians to the people who are being genocided in Gaza. It's, this must stop. This can't continue. If Israel continues down this line, we will do A, B, C, and D.
Right.
In reality, they are giving time for Israel to continue its ethnic cleansing, to continue its genocide, to continue to use starvation as a weapon of war and a means of subjugation. Then they're still helping them financially and militarily. And the British, with their overflights, hundreds and hundreds of overflights over Gaza, in order to give the intelligence to continue to murder Palestinian men, women, children, and babies in their tents, in the hospitals, queuing up for food, being moved from one area to another. I believe they just gave another evacuation order. I've seen the videos where tens of thousands of people are beginning to flee from an area that still had homes, that still had some form of shelter for the people, some form of infrastructure to allow some form of civil government to continue. So what he's saying about Israel is purely political propaganda for the internal consumption of the German population. The same in Britain, the same in France, the same in America. Then when it comes to Russia, there has been a plan long in the making where they want to balkanize Russia, which is a huge country, has some of the biggest mineral deposits in the world. They want to balkanize it into 9 separate component parts, all the easier for the imperialist, capitalists, and globalists to come in and then buy and privatize everything. That's what's happening in Britain. Privatize the health service, privatize education, privatize welfare, so that more and more money is taken from those people who need education, housing, health, and the social welfare is being sucked into corporations for the money to go up through the system. Thatcher and Reagan talked about the trickle down, but what we've watched in 40 years is the trickle up. So the rich get richer, a smaller and smaller percent of the rich own a larger and larger percentage of the wealth in individual countries and globally. So the plan that they have is potentially for the balkanization of Russia. They have been talking now for the last 6 to 12 months
Mm-hmm.
that everyone in Europe must increase their GDP to 5% on weapons and arms. They're talking openly in Britain, 28, 29, we're going to bring in conscription, and that's when we're going to have a war with Russia. So what they're going to do is, their plan, in my opinion, is to continue the war against Russia to the last Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm.
Russia wants peace, but it can't have a dialogue and it can't have a ceasefire with an unelected president, Zelensky, who doesn't have a
Mm-hmm.
mandate from the people to speak on their behalf. Now, on the 2nd of June, they're having more talks in Istanbul. But if we go all the way back to the Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 agreements, if Europe and Ukraine, and specifically the Germans and the French, who brokered the deal and said they would stand over it on behalf of Europe, both Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel then came out publicly and said that they had no intention of ever honouring the Minsk agreements. It was there to buy time in order to rearm the armed Ukrainian fascist forces in Kiev. So
Right.
there's no trust between Russia and Europe. Europe
Mm-hmm.
wants to see Russia destroyed. It's building up its army. It's building up its military infrastructure. It's building up the European military industrial complex. And the people who will suffer will be the people in Ukraine, the people in Donbass, the people in Russia, but also the people when the money comes out from the pensions diverted from the pensions, diverted from the health service, diverted from social welfare, diverted from social housing. They're going to take money from away from the most vulnerable people in Europe, put it into the military industrial complex to make money for the corporations and the shareholders, and then try and have some projected long range warfare with Russia with the intention of somehow destroying Russia, which I don't think they'll ever do, because they haven't learned that the British were defeated in the Crimea, the French were defeated under Napoleon, the Nazis were defeated under Hitler, and these pro-war hawks in Europe and America will again be defeated by the bravery and the steadfastness of the people of the Russian Federation.
Right. You mentioned some of the vulnerable peoples and their sufferings under this, European regimes. But the thing is that, I mean, they're continuously sending weapons to Ukraine, and the people here in Europe, obviously, they are so vulnerable and they are suffering because of that. Obviously, because that those money, those paychecks can go to healthcare, can go to education, can go to other things, obviously. And when it comes to Germany, obviously, in last 5 years, they I mean, have been in recession. Its social security system is on the verge of collapse. Its internal unity is falling apart. So obviously, the Germans are those who are suffering, but their aids or their monies or paychecks is going to the the Ukrainians. I mean, not the Ukrainians, obviously, the to fight the Russians. For a long, unending war. According to Statistica, obviously they make a poll out of it. Not poll, it's just a statistics. I mean, they showed by February 28, 2025, actually Germany sent military aid and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. It's 17.27 billion, and you can add 5 billion to that and much more than that. So it's they actually come second in terms of countries that sending military aids to Ukraine after United States. So that's a huge thing, basically, in a country where people are suffering, where vulnerables are suffering, as you said. So do you think that, okay, like these people actually are warmongers, but basically talking about peace, but they are pushing for a war against Russia?
Yes, they obviously don't want peace. If they wanted peace, they would have stood over the Minsk one and the Minsk two agreements. And then there was, I believe, a previous one in Istanbul as well, which they haven't honoured in the agreement. You know, the British were talking about when they increase their armament production, that this will lead to employment. It's
Right.
almost a joke, a counterbalance, that if there's unemployment, whenever there's war, there's full employment, because all
Right.
the men will be off at the front and all the women will be in the factories, like happened in the Second World War. So there is, in my mind and in my opinion, the majority of the people in Europe and Ukraine and Russia want peace. They
Right.
don't want this war. It's the governments that are in charge. The governments are put in place by their financial backers. So we all know that corporations can give us the best money that democracy can buy. I mean, whoever spends the most money in America appears to win the election. It's the same across Europe. Now, one wee point I want to touch on is exactly what you mentioned. When there's a breakdown within the social fabric of society, when people begin to struggle to pay increased rent, to pay inflation on goods, services, fuel, and food, when people then have to pay, the rents in Belfast are going through the roof. We're not talking about London or Dublin or Paris or Berlin or Frankfurt. We're talking about a small, this second, third largest city in Ireland, where rent is heading towards €800 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in a nice area or a two-bedroom house in a working class area. And what we're witnessing is exactly what happened in the 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
when people are struggling economically because of the political yoke that has been placed upon society.
Mm-hmm.
What appears to be the antidote to today's neoliberalism and the
Mm-hmm.
destruction of the civic infrastructure and the welfare state within Britain and all the way across Europe appears to be the right. So we're back in the 1930s. We're back seeing a rise of the right. I saw a video of guys in Italy, hundreds of them, all with their short hair, all dressed almost the same, with their bomber jackets on, almost like a military display, all giving the fascist salute. I mean, we're one step short of the torch-lit parades and processions that they had in Germany, which they've held from time to time in Kiev and Ukraine. So as the politicians destroy the fabric of society, what appears to, and then they use and promote Islamophobia and fear of the refugee. So if they weren't here, we'd have enough school places, enough social housing, there'd be no waiting list for the hospitals. It's all a lie, but they create the demonizing and the dehumanizing of the other to play the blame game. So they're the problem. It's not the government. It's not political policies. It's not the corporations who refuse to pay their tax. It's
Right.
not the globalist companies who take the profit out of the sovereign nation and take it back to America or wherever their headquarters are. We have to blame the Syrian. We have to blame the person from India or Pakistan. And that includes people who arrived 50 years ago and their sons and daughters and their grandchildren are all British citizens. They're already that guy who drove into the Liverpool football fans. Apparently, he's a white guy in his 30s with three children who's an ex member of the British Marines. So he's an ex soldier. And instead of demonizing him as someone who is potentially, I know where several people were in intensive care, they're saying he's a mild mannered man, he's a good neighbor, no one knows why he did what he did. I can guarantee you, if that had been someone with mental health issues from an immigrant community, this would be seen viewed as terrorism. But
Mm-hmm.
because he's a white English national, an ex-army, they're not even saying he has mental problems. They're just saying, nobody knows why he did it. He seems such a normal, happy-go-lucky guy with a family. I don't know why he did it. I'm not projecting my ideas onto him as the way he did what he did. But it's all part of this, you know, political kind of, I was going to say opportunism, but the politicians are destroying the fabric of society.
Right.
Then the right is being funded by Zionism and others to step into the vacuum created by the failure of the liberals and the
Right.
neoliberal austerity program as the saviors of the sovereign nations in Europe, which
Mm-hmm.
they aren't. They are thugs, some of them in suits and some of them articulate, but basically they are racists, fascists, thugs, and bullies. And it's the last people we want near power. But because we've been failed by those in power, and
Mm-hmm.
people are looking for something different, they're looking for change. Sadly, the right, because they're being financed by people in the background to be the next people in power who will be controlled. So it's almost as if the corporations, the globalizations, and I'm going to include parts of Zionism, see that the new neoliberal order is going to collapse. So they are creating the uh, the next set of politicians who they can control. So they're financing them now, they're profiling them now, they're giving them platforms on social media and main media
Mm-hmm.
with the idea that these will be the next politicians in the next 5 or 10 years, and they're already in the backs of the corporations, the billionaires, and the globalists. You will have a change of government, you will maybe have a change of policy, but the deep state and those that finance it in the background will continue to run the status quo, and nothing will change.
Right. So you are basically saying that whatever the politicians is, I mean, whether he's from the from conservative, whether he's from I mean, liberal background, the war is the only path to power, I guess, not the peace. at least for the Western countries, not the other continents, I guess, but for the Western countries. When it comes to Germany, I mean, if you talk about Olaf Scholz, I mean, who was the previous chancellor of Germany, he did the same thing, and this guy is doing the same thing again, right? It's just they are just pawns of, I mean, NATO. They're just basically doing what the US is doing. I mean, back it up. I mean, the EU, European Union, and European Commission. I mean, they are just following the orders from the empires. Obviously, Germany is also an empire in so many ways, but at the same time, they are just following what the US is doing or NATO is doing. You know, that's kind of same for all the politicians, whoever comes to power. So there is no solution to this in a way unless people will, there is an uprising from the common people in those countries, especially from the West, because these are the countries, I mean, funding wars, whether it's, I mean, in Ukraine, whether it's in Gaza, their money killing people on the Gaza, their money killing people on the Ukraine and on Russia. So basically, these are the common enemies of the people, not the Russians, not the Palestinians. These are the common enemies of the people, common people, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. It's imperialism. It's the pursuit of money, power, influence that causes so much angst and war and poverty and discrimination across the globe. What has been happening for the last 40 years in European politics, just like in America, the
Right.
two parties that are normally in opposition to each other, you used to have a left, you used to have a right, you used to
Yeah.
have a proper Labour Party and a proper Conservative Party, but they've all kind of collapsed into the centre.
Yeah.
So you could take a bit of paper and put that, between the policies. It's the only difference in the policies between the Republicans and the Democrats. Labour to me are just New Labour is just New Tory. That's how I view them.
Yeah.
So there's a very small, roomy political landscape that the main politicians go into. So that means that whoever's the deep state will allow you to move so much to the left and so much to the right, but otherwise it maintains the imperialist foreign policy to the benefit of the corporations, the billionaires, and the elite. And when it comes to people like Mertz,
Mm-hmm.
all these politicians, Stormer said he would protect pensions and the vulnerable people. And the first thing he did was take away the winter fuel allowance
Yeah.
for British pensioners, which was something like 3.2 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And he was then giving 3.4 billion or something like that to Ukraine. So you could automatically see, well, obviously he's taking the money from the pensioners and he's just sent it to Ukraine. So I have no tolerance or respect for politicians,
Yeah.
specifically in the West,
Mm-hmm.
because these people are compromised all the way through the political system until they get to the top. Jeremy Corbyn was the best British Prime Minister Britain never had, a man of integrity. But even saying that, Bernie Sanders in America, these people are still, they might be on the left, but they're still centrists. They won't get
Yeah.
into power and do a radical social reform of the departments of the government and bring in policies. They tinker with the system. They'll maybe increase the minimum wage, which would be welcome. They might increase pensions. They might put caps on the energy companies so that they can't be like screwing people into the ground as their profits become exponential and we have to pay more money for electricity, for broadband, for gas, for petrol, for
Mm-hmm.
diesel. Uh, so when it comes to the politicians, all I see are sound bites. I don't
Mm-hmm.
see any integrity. I don't see any depth to the person. I don't see any real policies. In opposition, you're a populist. You tell the people what they want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
We'll reduce the waiting lists in the health service. We build more social housing. To come in the power with a plan, we create 200,000 social housing units in 5 years, and then they do 80,000 and the rest of them are for private rent or for mortgages for people to buy homes, if they even build as many as they promise in opposition. So I've no time for them. They're just sound bites. If you got one of them into a room and you had a conversation like we're having, and you scratch the surface beyond the, well, this is what we want to do, this is the plan for government, and then you ask them how they're going to institute it, or where they're going to get the money, or why they're not doing this, or why they're not doing that, they don't have any answers,
Yeah.
and they're not questioned critically in the media or on television, because I see the interviews from time to time, and sound bites. Israel has the right to defend itself. No one should be anti-Semitic. If Hamas hadn't done what it did on October 7th, none of this would have happened. But if you ask them about 1948 and 1967 and about the expulsion and ethnically cleansing of Palestinians from 1902 onwards until the present day, they won't know facts and figures. Now, if I stop someone in the street and they don't know facts and figures, I don't hold them responsible for that. They have children to bring up, work to go to, bills to pay, older parents to take care of. But a politician who claims to be representing a particular strand of politics, who doesn't know the ins and outs of the situation of a genocide that's been occurring for nearly 2 years
Mm-hmm.
live on social media. When those people don't know the facts, when they're either erroneous or they're being deceitful, that is a completely different story.
Right. And it's the same when it comes to Ukraine, it's the same when it comes to the Gaza situation.